He slammed the door in her face with the words, "You disgust me." 4 years later, he broke down in tears when he saw the children who looked just like him. Maggie Brooks had always believed that love wasn't supposed to hurt this way. She had given up everything she once thought she wanted because she believed she had finally found someone worth changing her life for. Lucas Grayson, one of the most successful CEOs in Manhattan, had swept her into a world she had only ever seen in movies. Penthouse apartments with city views that sparkled like diamonds. Dinners and restaurants where reservations booked months ahead could suddenly appear with his name. Cars so quiet they made her heartbeat sound loud. He was magnetic, handsome, with midnight dark hair and eyes the color of a clear winter sky, and every woman wanted him, and for a moment, he chose her. In private, behind closed doors, he held her as if she were the only warm thing in his cold world. He murmured in her ear that she made him forget the noise in his head. And she believed every word, even when his touch grew distant, even when his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. She had been so desperate to keep that version of him alive that she ignored the signs of the gathering storm. The day everything shattered began like any other. Maggie made breakfast, kissed Lucas's cheek before he left for his morning meetings, and spent the afternoon finishing a marketing project she hoped would impress him. When he returned home, she could see he was exhausted, the tension in his jaw, his shoulders stiff under his expensive suit, but she didn't let fear stop her. She took a breath, walked up to him with her heart in her hands, and told him she was pregnant. She braced herself for surprise, confusion, maybe even anger, but deep down she hoped for softness. A smile. An embrace. Something that told her she hadn't been a fool for loving him. Instead, Lucas stared at her with an expression that froze her blood. No shock. No hesitation. Only cold calculation, as though he were analyzing a spreadsheet with a percentage he didn't like. For too many seconds, he said nothing. Then, with a disgusted exhale, he stepped away from her. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and sharp, like steel scraping against glass. "You disgust me." Maggie didn't think she heard him correctly at first. The words were so vile, so cruel, that her brain refused to process them. But then he walked to the door without a glance back, and the finality of his footsteps hit harder than the insult itself. He opened the door, paused as though deciding whether he owed her anything more, and then slammed it shut behind him. Silence swallowed the room. Maggie stood frozen, every cell in her body trembling. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, as if shielding the tiny life inside from the words that had cut so deep. She could still hear the echo, "You disgust me," reverberating through her chest like a heartbeat gone wrong. Tears rose so fast she choked on them, sinking to the floor as if her legs could no longer remember how to hold her. She didn't know how long she stayed there, curled in on herself, the glittering skyline outside mocking her with its beauty. The apartment felt daunting and unkind without him in it, as if the walls themselves had turned against her. When the sun rose, painting the city gold, Maggie realized that nothing about her life was hers anymore. Lucas had replaced the furniture, chosen the decor, dictated every plan and decision. Her family was hundreds of miles away, and she hadn't spoken to her friends in months because her entire world had been consumed by him. There was no place for her here now. No reason left to stay. With mechanical movements, she got to her feet and began packing. She only took what belonged to her, a few clothes, some books, her laptop, and the tiny ultrasound photo she had taken earlier that week. The photo that had filled her with joy before he corrupted it with his rejection. She left her key on the counter. There was nothing else to say. She boarded a bus that evening, her stomach twisting with nausea and sorrow, watching the city that had once promised her everything blur into a smear of lights and memories she could no longer bear to hold. As the miles passed, Maggie pressed a protective hand to her abdomen, whispering through a voice shredded by tears, "I'm sorry you heard that. I won't let anyone speak to us like that again. I'm not going to let you feel unwanted ever." She had no idea where she would go. She had no idea how she would survive. But she did know one thing: Lucas Grayson would never have another opportunity to break her again. That night, somewhere between cities she couldn't name and the future she couldn't see, she fell asleep curled against the window of the bus, exhaustion finally claiming her. And in that vulnerable moment, her last coherent thought was both a promise and a plea, that someday, this pain would mean something. That someday, she wouldn't remember his rejection as the end of her story, but as the beginning of one worth living. The bus stopped in a quiet town just before dawn, the kind of place that didn't make headlines, where no one looked twice at a stranger stepping off with a single suitcase and tired eyes. Maggie didn't choose the town because it was special. She chose it because she was too exhausted to stay on the road any longer, and something in the peaceful silence of the early streets made her feel like she could finally breathe again. The buildings were old but well kept, the sidewalks cracked but clean, and the air smelled like pine and distant rain. It was a place untouched by people like Lucas Grayson, and for the first time in days, she didn't feel haunted by his voice. She found a room to rent above a bakery where the landlord didn't ask questions. The smell of fresh bread drifted up through the floorboards every morning, a strange comfort that reminded her she was still alive. She found a small clinic nearby and started her prenatal checkups again. The doctor was kind and gentle and never asked why she was alone. She worked up the courage to apply for a part-time job at a small bookstore across the street. The owner was an older woman named Ruth who didn't care about resumes as long as Maggie showed up on time and loved books. Maggie did both. She sorted shelves, rang up customers, and spent her lunch breaks reading pregnancy books, trying to prepare for the only future she had now. Her pregnancy wasn't easy. She was constantly tired, her body aching in ways she had never known. The doctor confirmed what she had started to suspect: twins. Maggie sat in stunned silence as she looked at the monitor, seeing two tiny, fluttering heartbeats. She smiled, but tears fell at the same time. 2 heartbeats meant double the diapers, double the crying, double the fear. But it also meant double the love, and in her heart, she knew it was no accident. Life had taken everything from her, but it was giving her these 2 souls. They were the reason she would survive. As the weeks passed, she began to build a life from scratch. She went to work, saved every penny, learned how to stretch meals and budget every cent. She bought second-hand baby clothes, read parenting forums late into the night, and painted the small back room in soft colors, one wall at a time. There were days she woke up paralyzed by fear, overwhelmed by how alone she was. Nights when she felt the ache of his rejection like a bruise that hadn't healed. But every time one of the babies kicked, she remembered why she couldn't fall apart. She talked to them constantly, telling them stories, singing softly as she folded their clothes or rubbed her swollen belly. She wasn't sure if they could feel how much she loved them, but she hoped they could. One cold night in late autumn, the pain came too early. She collapsed on the bathroom floor, barely able to reach her phone. The ambulance lights flashed like lightning through the windows. In the hospital, everything blurred into noise and bright white light. The nurses worked quickly, voices calm but urgent. She was terrified. It was too soon, it wasn't time. But her body had made its decision, and all she could do was hold on. Hours later, when she woke, her arms were empty, and her voice cracked as she asked if the babies were alive. They were. 2 premature infants, tiny but fighting. The doctor told her they were strong, that they had a chance, but the road ahead would be hard. Maggie spent the next weeks in the NICU, barely sleeping, her chair pulled up beside two incubators where her children fought to breathe. She named them Ava and Caleb. They were so small, their hands no bigger than her fingertip. She read to them every day, held them skin to skin when the nurses allowed it, sang the lullabies her mother once sang to her. Every beep from the machines made her heart stop, every pause in their breathing stole the air from her lungs. She lived minute by minute, heartbeat by heartbeat. The nurses began to call her the fighter. They said she was the calmest mother in the ward, the one who never broke down, the one who whispered hope into her babies even when the monitors screamed. But they didn't see the nights Maggie spent in the hospital bathroom, curled on the tile floor, sobbing into her hands. They didn't hear the prayers she whispered to a God she wasn't even sure she believed in anymore. All she knew was that she had to stay, had to keep showing up, had to be strong even when she wasn't. When Ava finally opened her eyes for the first time, Maggie laughed through her tears. When Caleb wrapped his fingers around hers, she knew she would never let go. They were hers. Not his. Not anyone else's. Hers. The world could take everything, but it could never take this. And even in the darkest hours of that hospital ward, she began to believe, maybe just barely, that this pain wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something no one could ever take away. The day Maggie finally brought Ava and Caleb home was bitterly cold, the kind of winter morning where the frost clung to every windowpane and the air bit at her cheeks the second she stepped outside. But to her, it felt like the first day of spring. After nearly 2 months in the NICU, 2 months of hourly updates, of living between monitors and whispered medical terms, she was finally allowed to hold her children not just for hours at a time, but for good. Bundled in tiny coats too big for their fragile frames, her babies were swaddled like hope wrapped in blankets, and as she stepped into the small apartment above the bakery once again, her eyes filled with tears. Everything looked the same: worn carpet, peeling wallpaper, a second-hand crib tucked into the corner, but it felt entirely new. This was no longer the place she ran to. It was the place they would grow up in. The first few weeks were a blur of feedings, sleepless nights, and moments of panic when one of the babies wouldn't stop crying and she didn't know why. Maggie had no one to call, no mother or sister to lean on, no friend to knock on her door with hot soup or an extra set of arms. It was just her. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would sit on the floor between the two cribs, clutching a cold bottle in one hand, rocking a baby with her knee, trying not to cry from exhaustion. But every time one of the twins looked up at her with those wide, blue eyes that mirrored a past she was trying to forget, she found the strength to keep going. Not because it was easy. It never was. But because she had made them a promise the day they were born, that they would never feel unwanted. She returned to work at the bookstore when the twins were almost 3 months old, leaving them at a small in-home daycare run by a retired nurse named June. It killed Maggie to walk away that first morning, to leave her babies with a stranger, but she didn't have a choice. She needed money. Rent was due. Formula wasn't cheap. Diapers never lasted as long as she hoped. At the bookstore, her hands shelved novels while her mind stayed with her children. But slowly, a rhythm began to form. Wake up, feed, dress, daycare, work, pick up, dinner, bath, stories, collapse into sleep, and start again. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what she once imagined. But it was real, and it was theirs. Despite how much she tried to forget, there were moments when the past broke through the surface. Every time a tall man in a tailored suit walked into the store, her heart would stop before her mind caught up. Lucas's face haunted her in the smallest details, the way Caleb tilted his head when he was curious, the exact shade of Ava's eyes, that icy blue that didn't come from her. She didn't speak his name. She didn't tell the children where they came from. At first, she thought it was fear that kept her silent. But over time, she realized it was protection. She didn't want them to grow up feeling like a mistake someone had walked away from. At night, when the twins finally slept and the apartment went still, Maggie sometimes allowed herself to remember. She would sit by the window with a cup of tea gone cold and stare out at the quiet street. She thought about who she used to be, the girl who believed love could fix broken things, the woman who stood in a penthouse apartment thinking a man like Lucas could ever want forever. That woman had died the day he shut the door on her. But something else had been born in her place. Someone stronger. Someone fiercer. Someone who didn't need to be chosen to know her worth. And yet, there were cracks. As hard as she worked to build a wall between then and now, sometimes she caught herself wondering if he ever thought of them. Did he wonder where she went? Did he ever wake in the middle of the night, haunted by what he said, by what he lost? Or had he moved on so easily, so completely, that their lives didn't even flicker in his memory? She didn't know what was worse, him forgetting, or him remembering and not caring. Still, Maggie kept going. The bookstore became more than a job. Ruth became a friend, sometimes a grandmother figure to the twins, slipping them storybooks and warm muffins. June watched the kids when Maggie picked up extra shifts or when a fever hit in the middle of the night. Slowly, she found a kind of family, not by blood, but by kindness and shared survival. She still carried the weight of everything alone, but it no longer crushed her. It simply became part of her. And as Ava and Caleb grew, taking their first steps, saying their first words, laughing and crying in unison like the two halves of her heart, Maggie knew that no matter how painful her story had been, it had led her to this. It had led her to them. And that was worth every tear, every sleepless night, every memory she wished she could erase. They were not the ending of her old life. They were the beginning of a new one. One she had built with nothing but grit, love, and the quiet belief that even the most broken things can bloom again. Lucas Grayson had not thought of Maggie Brooks for a long time, or at least that's what he told himself. His days were overrun with meetings, travel, headlines, and polished dinners where no one ever told the truth. His empire had grown, his name was etched into skyscrapers and luxury brands, and his face appeared on magazine covers next to numbers that only rose with each quarter. But the silence that filled his penthouse at night was the kind that crept under the skin. He had women. Plenty of them. Beautiful, ambitious, carefully curated to match his lifestyle, none of whom lasted more than a few weeks. They came and went like changing decor. And yet, none of them stayed. None of them made him feel anything anymore. He would occasionally glance at old photos on his phone, pretending he was just cleaning out storage when his thumb would freeze over a picture he forgot hadn't been deleted. Maggie laughing in the sunlight on the balcony. Maggie curled up on the couch with a book. Maggie holding an ultrasound in a shaky hand, tears in her eyes, hope and fear tangled together. That last one he deleted, finally, but the image stayed in his mind longer than he cared to admit. He remembered the day he walked out on her, the way her face had fallen, how quiet she had gone. At the time, he had convinced himself it was mercy. That she was too soft for his world. That he would have destroyed her eventually. But now he wondered if the destruction had already happened the moment he turned the handle and didn't look back. What brought her back into his world was not guilt, not even memory. It was a coincidence, or maybe something more cruel. His company sponsored a charity event at a hospital upstate, one of many facilities his name was tied to through funding and investments. He didn't care for public visits, but the board insisted on a photo opportunity. So he came. Flashbulbs, forced smiles, cold hallways, and the usual parade of small talk. He shook hands with doctors, glanced at children he barely noticed, until one of the nurses asked if he'd like to visit the neonatal wing. Something in the way she said it made him pause, and without knowing why, he agreed. The room was quiet, a cocoon of soft beeping and sterile air, lined with new mothers and sleeping infants. And then he saw her. At first, he thought he was imagining it. She was turned away, gently rocking a baby in her arms, wearing a yellow sweater, her hair tied in a messy bun. She looked thinner, paler, but unmistakable. He stopped breathing. His world shrank to the space between her and the child she was holding. And then she turned, and her green eyes locked with his. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. She simply stood frozen, like a deer caught in headlights, like a dream that had turned into something real and dangerous. But it wasn't just her. At her side was another infant in a pink onesie, identical to the one she was holding. And both of them had dark hair and piercing blue eyes that looked too familiar, too specific to ignore. He felt it in his gut, the cold punch of recognition. Twins. Girls. About a year old, maybe less. Eyes like his. It was impossible. And yet, not at all. He felt the ground shift under him. For the first time in years, he couldn't think, couldn't calculate, couldn't control his face. He simply stared, eyes wide, mouth open, until the nurse beside him touched his arm and asked if he was all right. Maggie turned away, clutching both girls protectively. She didn't say a word. Didn't give him a chance to speak. A moment later, she was gone, out the door with her daughters, leaving him in a fluorescent-lit hallway with nothing but silence and the pounding echo of his own heartbeat. Lucas stood there long after she left, unable to move. He barely heard the rest of the tour, couldn't remember what he said to the press. On the flight back to New York, he didn't open his laptop. For the first time in a long time, business meant nothing. Numbers didn't distract him. The only thing he could see was Maggie's face. The babies. His daughters. He didn't know how to explain what he felt. It wasn't just shock. It wasn't just guilt. It was something deeper. A kind of loss he didn't understand yet. A realization that while he had been building towers of steel and glass, something real had grown without him. Something beautiful. And he had missed all of it. That night, he didn't go home. He walked the streets for hours, hands buried in his coat pockets, head down. His reflection in the windows looked like a stranger. And somewhere between Madison Avenue and the park where no one recognized him, Lucas Grayson, the man who thought he could buy or rebuild anything, finally realized he might have destroyed the only thing that ever truly mattered before it even had a chance to begin. Of course. Here's a detailed continuation of Chapter 5 in English, without any headings or single-sentence paragraphs, as requested. Lucas didn't sleep the night after seeing Maggie again. No matter how many times he closed his eyes, the image of her standing there in that hospital hallway with two babies in her arms, babies who looked unmistakably like him, played on a loop in his mind. The shock had left him breathless, but now it was replaced with something far worse, regret. The silence that had once protected his pride now felt suffocating. He had spent the last 4 years pretending he made the right choice, believing that pushing her away had been an act of strength, not cowardice. But seeing the result of that decision so vividly shattered all illusions. He hadn't just walked away from her. He had walked away from them. The next morning, he didn't go into the office. For the first time in years, he canceled all his meetings, turned off his phone, and ignored the relentless buzzing of his assistant. Instead, he sat in the corner of his sleek, cold kitchen, made of glass and marble but utterly lifeless, and tried to understand how he could fix what he had broken. He had no contact for her. She had vanished from his world without a trace after that night. A part of him had always assumed it was for the best. He thought she would move on, forget him, maybe even be better off. But she hadn't just moved on, she had built a life without him, a life that included his children, and she had done it alone. He hired a private investigator, someone discreet. He hated the idea of invading her privacy, but he didn't know any other way. Within a few days, the man returned with a small file. Maggie Brooks, residing in a quiet neighborhood 2 hours north of the city. A modest apartment above a small bookstore. No romantic affiliations. Works part-time at the same store. Raises 2 children, Ava and Caleb. Healthy. Active. Described by neighbors as warm, responsible, and private. No mention of their father anywhere. It was as if Lucas had been erased. But when he saw the photographs, Maggie walking the twins to a local park, crouching down to wipe tears or tie shoes, always alone, he felt a sharp, bitter pain settle in his chest. He didn't know how to approach her. Barging in would feel like a violation, but staying away was no longer an option. So he drove up one afternoon, heart pounding, hands sweating, rehearsing every possible way to say what couldn't be unsaid. He didn't expect to be welcomed. He expected anger. Maybe even hate. What he didn't expect was to find her working behind the counter, her hair pulled back, a tired smile on her face as she handed a customer their receipt. She looked up, and the moment she saw him, the smile vanished. The color drained from her face. But she didn't say a word. She walked into the back room and closed the door. Lucas stood frozen. The air in the bookstore felt heavier now. The customer glanced at him curiously before leaving. He waited, unsure if he should follow her, unsure if he had the right. But after a minute, she returned. Her eyes were glassy, and her voice, when she spoke, was quiet and calm. She told him she didn't want a scene. That the twins were safe. That they didn't know who he was and that she didn't plan to change that. He tried to speak, but she interrupted him. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. That almost hurt more. She simply told him she had nothing to say to a man who had once looked her in the eye and told her she was disgusting, then vanished when she needed him most. He asked if he could meet the children. She shook her head. She said they were not some second chance to make himself feel better. They were not a performance. They were people, small, innocent people, who had never even heard his name. And he didn't get to show up 4 years later and ask for inclusion just because he suddenly realized he missed out. He asked her if there was anything he could do. She said no. And then she told him to leave. But Lucas didn't leave town. He stayed at a hotel nearby. He spent his days sitting in the car down the street from the bookstore, watching her bring the twins home, helping them into their coats, laughing at something one of them said. He saw them through the bakery window, sitting on stools, swinging their legs, their faces identical to photos of his own childhood. He watched Caleb chase a leaf down the sidewalk and Ava fall asleep against Maggie's shoulder. He wasn't stalking. He was witnessing what he had missed. It felt both cruel and necessary. And one night, when Maggie spotted his car parked across the street and didn't come over to yell or ask why, he knew it was the beginning of something. Not forgiveness. But a crack in the wall. He left a letter for her at the bookstore. Not to beg. Just to explain. Not as the man who once broke her heart, but as the man who had finally seen what that decision had cost. He told her about the dreams he'd had since the hospital. About how nothing felt whole anymore. He said he didn't expect anything. Not even a response. He just needed her to know that he saw them. All 3 of them. And he wasn't going to disappear again. She didn't reply. Not at first. But a week later, he found a note slipped under the windshield of his car. 4 words. They start school Monday. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a welcome. But it was something. And for Lucas, it was enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't over. That maybe, if he was patient, if he showed up every day with humility instead of excuses, he might one day earn the right to be part of the life he had once so carelessly walked away from. Lucas didn't know what to expect that Monday morning, but he woke up before the alarm, dressed in a dark sweater instead of a suit, and drove the quiet streets with his heart racing in a way it never did for boardrooms or billion-dollar mergers. The small local elementary school was tucked between 2 old brick buildings, its playground empty in the early morning fog. He parked across the street, far enough not to be noticed, close enough to see. When Maggie arrived with the twins, holding one small hand in each of hers, he nearly stopped breathing. Ava wore a purple coat with stars on the sleeves, Caleb's was green with dinosaur patches. They looked too small for the backpacks they carried. Lucas watched as Maggie bent down to zip up Caleb's jacket and kissed the top of Ava's head. He didn't try to go near them. He just watched, heart in his throat, as the door closed behind them and his chance to begin, however small, slipped into a building full of possibilities. The next few days passed in much the same way. Lucas remained at a distance, never approaching, never intruding. He didn't want to force himself into their world like a storm. He wanted to be steady, present, even if unnoticed. After a week, Maggie began to acknowledge him with the smallest nod when she saw him across the street. Then one afternoon, as she waited outside the school, he saw Caleb run out the doors, trip over his shoelaces, and fall hard. Lucas didn't think, he moved. He crossed the street before he realized he had done it and knelt beside the boy just as Maggie reached him. Caleb wasn't crying yet, stunned more than hurt. Lucas gently picked him up and handed him to Maggie, asking if he was all right. Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment, the years seemed to fall away. She nodded, and though she said nothing, she didn't pull Caleb away from him. The next day, when Ava walked past him and paused for a curious second, Lucas smiled. She didn't smile back, but she didn't look scared. That night, Maggie sent him a message. "If you're serious about this, they start soccer next week. Saturday morning. Don't be late." He didn't sleep well that night, not because of anxiety but because of hope. It had been so long since he allowed himself to feel it. Saturday came with early sun and dew-covered grass. Lucas arrived at the field before anyone else, watching volunteers set up cones and mini goals. When Maggie arrived with the twins, she walked over to him without hesitation. She handed him a water bottle and sunscreen for Caleb and said if he was going to be here, he might as well be useful. Lucas grinned and followed her lead, listening carefully as she gave instructions. Throughout the morning, he tied shoelaces, passed juice boxes, and cheered from the sidelines. The first time Ava scored a goal, she looked over at him, and he clapped so loud half the field turned around. Her cheeks flushed pink, but she smiled, just a little, and that was enough to make his chest ache. After practice, Maggie didn't rush off like usual. They sat at a picnic bench while the kids played. The conversation started cautiously, polite, about the children's teachers, their favorite bedtime books, their personalities, Ava's quiet strength, Caleb's boundless energy. Lucas soaked up every word. And then, after a long pause, Maggie asked the question that had lived between them unspoken for years. "Why now?" Lucas didn't deflect. He told her the truth. He told her that he thought about her more than he admitted, that he buried it under work and silence and excuses. He told her that seeing her at the hospital wasn't a coincidence, it was a revelation, like a curtain had been pulled back. He told her that he knew he didn't deserve her forgiveness, that he had no right to ask to be part of the twins' lives after disappearing, but he couldn't stay away now that he knew them. He said he wanted to show up. To try. Not to fix the past, but to earn a place in their present. Maggie didn't respond right away. She looked out at the children, watching them chase a butterfly across the grass. Her voice was soft when she finally spoke. She told him she had hated him. Truly, deeply hated him for a long time. But she had let it go when Ava called her Mama for the first time, and when Caleb ran to her after his first nightmare. She said forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean trusting again overnight. But she didn't want her children to grow up missing something that might one day become good, if handled with care. Lucas nodded. He told her he would wait. For however long it took. That he wouldn't pressure them or push his way in. That he'd be there every weekend for soccer, every afternoon he was allowed to be nearby, and someday, when the kids were ready, he'd be the one to answer their questions with honesty, no matter how uncomfortable. Weeks passed like that, each one warmer than the last. Lucas became a quiet fixture in their world. He learned what Ava liked on her pancakes and how Caleb liked to be spun before bed. He was allowed to pick them up from school once a week. He started reading bedtime stories on Thursdays while Maggie answered emails. They didn't talk about the past often, but one night, as the twins slept in the next room and they shared coffee over the kitchen counter, Maggie said she never expected to feel safe with him again. But now, sometimes, she did. Not always. Not fully. But sometimes. Lucas didn't reply with words. He just looked at her with the kind of quiet remorse that couldn't be faked. And in that moment, she saw not the man who walked out years ago, but the one who stayed now, not to be forgiven, but to become someone worth forgiving. Autumn crept in with slow, golden fingers, painting the town in shades of amber, burnt orange, and quiet nostalgia. The leaves crunched underfoot on the small path leading to Maggie's apartment, and every evening, Lucas found himself arriving a little earlier than necessary, just to walk that path, to feel the earth shift beneath him in a way that reminded him that change, real change, was always gradual. Maggie had stopped looking surprised when he showed up. She even texted him reminders now, about soccer schedules, school plays, dentist appointments. They weren't romantic texts, and she signed off with just her name, never anything softer, but Lucas read each one like a thread that kept him tethered to something that mattered more than anything else he'd ever built in boardrooms or behind polished glass. The twins had changed, too. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in small details that carved themselves deeply into his heart. Ava had started reaching for his hand without thinking when they crossed the street. Caleb had taken to showing him his artwork after school, narrating every crayon-scribbled detail with such pride that Lucas started keeping every drawing, stacking them in a folder he carried back to his penthouse, even though that home felt emptier with each passing week. His place was still quiet, still sleek and sterile, but now it seemed to echo with things that weren't there, footsteps too light to leave prints, giggles that never touched those walls, bedtime stories that had no room to unfold in rooms built for silence. One Friday evening, after dinner and baths and pajamas, Maggie was curled up on the couch, reading emails on her laptop while Lucas helped the twins build a pillow fort in the living room. They were deep into it, blankets over chairs, couch cushions as walls, a flashlight as their campfire, when the phone rang. Maggie's voice changed as she answered. Lucas couldn't hear the words, but he felt the shift in the air, the sudden stillness in her shoulders, the way she stood up too fast and dropped her phone onto the kitchen table with trembling fingers. He was at her side in seconds, asking what was wrong, and she finally whispered the word that made his blood run cold: hospital. It was her mother. A stroke. Sudden, severe. She lived 3 hours away, alone, estranged for years after a lifetime of disappointment and distance. Maggie looked torn between fear and responsibility. She said she had to go, tonight, couldn't bring the kids, didn't know how long she'd be gone. Lucas didn't wait for her to ask. He told her to pack a bag and go. He would stay with the twins. It wasn't even a question. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then her eyes filled with something quieter, trust, or maybe exhaustion, and she nodded. She kissed the children quickly, told them she had to visit Grandma, and promised to call in the morning. Lucas helped her carry her bag to the car. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The hours that followed were a blur of bedtime routines, a few tears from Ava who missed her mom, and Caleb crawling into Lucas's lap asking if he was going to sleep over. Lucas nodded and said yes, if that was okay. He slept on the couch, barely sleeping at all, listening to every creak of the building, every shift in the wind. In the morning, he made pancakes from a box he found in the cupboard and burned the first batch. The kids laughed and told him Mom always burned the first ones too, and for the first time, he felt like he belonged. Maggie stayed at the hospital for 2 days. During that time, Lucas became everything: cook, chauffeur, storyteller, bedtime singer, fort builder, sock finder. He made mistakes. He gave them cereal for dinner one night and forgot about the class picture form until Ava reminded him with a stern 4-year-old glare. But he was there, fully, no distractions, no calls from the office, no thoughts of stock prices or mergers. Only them. When Maggie finally returned, pale and tired, Lucas opened the door and saw something break in her expression, not from sadness, but relief. She walked in, and the twins ran to her, clinging to her legs, talking over each other in a frenzy of welcome. Lucas stood back, watching the reunion, not wanting to intrude. But when Maggie turned to him, she didn't ask him to leave. She said thank you, softly, like it carried more than just gratitude. Then she said something else, something that startled them both. She asked if he wanted to stay for dinner. That night, they ate together, not like guests, not like strangers, but like something closer to a family, even if no one dared to say the word. After the kids fell asleep, Lucas helped her wash the dishes. Maggie leaned against the counter, her hands in soapy water, and for the first time in years, she told him about her mother. The years of silence, the bitter fights, the loneliness. And then she said something he never expected. She said that if she had faced this alone a year ago, she would have broken. But this time, she didn't. Because of him. Lucas didn't know what to say. So he didn't speak. He just stood there, next to her, and dried a plate. And when she turned and leaned her forehead gently against his chest, he held her, carefully, like something fragile, and didn't let go. That night, he stayed again. Not because he asked to, and not because she said yes, but because there was no longer a need to ask. Something unspoken had shifted. The past hadn't disappeared, but for the first time, it wasn't a wall. It was a bridge. One built slowly, painfully, and with a kind of love that didn't announce itself, but revealed itself over time, in burnt pancakes, in soccer games, in sitting beside someone in silence when there were no right words, only presence. Lucas lay awake on the couch long after the lights were off, the hum of the heater the only sound. He listened to the quiet breathing of his children down the hall and the soft creak of Maggie's footsteps above him. And for the first time since he met her, he wasn't planning how to win, or fix, or prove anything. He was just there, and it was enough. Winter melted into spring slowly that year, like the world was waking up from something heavy. The snowbanks shrank down into puddles, the trees began budding again, and for the first time in a long time, the air didn't feel like something they had to survive. Maggie stood in the kitchen window one Saturday morning, watching the kids draw on the sidewalk with chalk while Lucas helped them spell out their names in colorful, clumsy letters. She sipped her coffee in silence, trying to understand the feeling blooming inside her. It wasn't certainty, not exactly, but something close. A quiet peace. She'd spent so many years learning to do everything on her own, learning not to need, not to rely, not to hope. But now, she didn't feel like she was standing alone. Not anymore. Lucas had become a fixture in their lives. Not a guest. Not an outsider. He knew the names of their stuffed animals, the sound of Ava's cry when it wasn't real, the way Caleb got quiet when he was overwhelmed instead of loud. He knew what brand of toothpaste they liked and which bedtime story Maggie used when she needed them to fall asleep fast. More than that, he knew Maggie. The real her. The one that wasn't polished or guarded. The one who got frustrated over bills and anxious over medical appointments and teared up when Ava called her brave. She had stopped hiding from him, and he had never once used anything she shared against her. That alone was something she never thought she'd feel again, safe. He didn't ask her for anything. No promises. No declarations. He never brought up the past unless she did, and even then, he didn't try to rewrite it. He admitted his failures without deflection. That kind of honesty wasn't flashy or romantic. It was hard and quiet, and it made her trust him more than flowers ever could. Maggie had spent so long being afraid that opening the door again would mean getting hurt all over. But day by day, Lucas hadn't just knocked on the door, he had rebuilt it with her. When the twins' 4th birthday approached, they asked if Daddy could come to their party. Maggie didn't correct them. She just smiled and said of course. They planned a small gathering in the park with a handful of friends, balloons tied to picnic tables, a cake shaped like a rocket ship because Caleb had become obsessed with space. Lucas showed up early, helped Maggie carry folding chairs from the car, and wore the paper party hat Ava insisted he couldn't remove all day. When the kids blew out their candles, Lucas stood beside Maggie, one hand resting gently on her back, not possessive, just present. She leaned into him without thinking. It felt right. After the party, when the sun was setting and the guests had gone home, Lucas didn't leave. The kids were playing in the grass, too full of sugar and laughter to notice the heaviness in the air. Maggie turned to him, her voice low, and said that she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him. Not of what they were becoming. She told him that love didn't scare her. Losing it did. But what scared her more was pushing it away before it had a chance to exist. Lucas didn't respond with a speech. He didn't fall to his knees or make dramatic declarations. He simply took her hand and said that everything he'd ever run from in his life, vulnerability, truth, connection, had led him here. And this time, he wasn't running. He told her he didn't need a label, didn't need a timeline. He just needed to be with her. To be part of their lives in whatever way she'd allow, for as long as she'd let him. That night, after the twins had fallen asleep and the stars came out one by one, they sat on the front steps of her apartment, legs brushing, the air filled with the hum of spring. Maggie turned her face toward him, not with hesitation this time, but with quiet certainty. When he kissed her, it wasn't a first kiss. It wasn't a reunion. It was something in between. Something built over years, over pain, over second chances that were never supposed to happen. In the weeks that followed, Lucas began spending more nights at the apartment. He never brought work with him. He left his phone on silent during dinner. He told his assistant he wasn't traveling for the next 6 months. For the first time, his company wasn't the center of his universe. It was still important, but it wasn't everything. His everything was now wrapped in tiny arms that hugged his legs when he walked in the door and in the woman who waited up for him with tired eyes and warm tea. He started building a life that didn't need to be earned or performed, it just needed to be lived. One rainy evening, Maggie found him sitting in the living room, reading a space encyclopedia with Caleb on one knee and Ava curled into his side. She stood in the doorway for a long time, watching them, arms crossed, heart full. When he looked up and saw her there, he smiled the kind of smile she'd never seen in him before. Not the charming, calculated grin of a man who closed deals, but the soft, almost boyish expression of someone who had finally found where he belonged. Maggie walked over, kissed his forehead, and whispered that this messy, ordinary, incredible life, was something she never thought she'd have again. Lucas held her gaze, his voice low but firm, and said, "Neither did I." And for the first time in either of their lives, that wasn't a loss. It was a beginning. Not a perfect one, not a fairy tale, but a real one, earned through pain, rebuilt with patience, and rooted in the kind of love that doesn't demand attention but proves itself in the quiet, in the showing up, in the staying. They didn't need vows or guarantees. They had something better. They had each other. And this time, they weren't letting go.